It was a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1963, and the mud in Saunders County, Nebraska, was the kind that doesn't just grab at your boots, it grabs at your soul. 18 men stood along the fence line of County Road 16, arms folded, hats pulled low. Some of them had driven out from Wahoo just to watch, not to help, to watch. And in the middle of that black, boot-swallowing field, a field that every man there had already declared unworkable, a small, rust-streaked machine let out a low mechanical growl that you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears. It was a 1951 Caterpillar D2 crawler, 12 years old, paint the color of old dried mustard, tracks so worn the cleats were smooth as river rock. And behind the controls, a 61-year-old man named Elmer Kosh, who hadn't said a word to anyone all morning. He didn't need to. Let me tell you about Saunders County, Nebraska in the spring of 1963. If you've never driven through that stretch of eastern Nebraska in April, close your eyes for a moment and try to picture it. Rolling hills that seem soft from a distance, gentle, almost lazy, until you get up close and realize the ground underneath those hills has its own personality, its own stubbornness. The soil there is a mix of loam and heavy clay that, after a wet winter, becomes something closer to wet concrete than farmland. It doesn't drain, it sits. It waits. The Platte River runs through the southern edge of the county, and that spring of 1963 she had run high and slow, and the runoff had pushed moisture into the lowland fields weeks longer than normal. March had been bitter cold. April came in warm and wet. By the first week of May, prime planting season, the bottom quarter of half the farms in the county were still saturated. Farmers were nervous. In 1963, the cost of seed corn was running about $4.50 a bushel. Diesel was 23 cents a gallon, and the bank didn't care what the weather had done. The bank cared about what you planted. The men who had conventional wheeled tractors, your Farmall 400s, your Oliver 88s, your brand new John Deere 4010s, they were stuck. Literally. 3 different farmers had already tried to break ground on the heavy, saturated lowland fields north of Wahoo and had pulled their equipment out with nothing but wheel ruts and wounded pride to show for it. The ground was winning. And that is precisely the moment this story truly begins. Elmer Heinrich Kosh was born in 1902 in a farmhouse that no longer exists, on a piece of land that his father had broken from raw Nebraska prairie with a team of horses and a single-bottom plow. He was the 4th of 7 children. He never finished high school, pulled out after 8th grade to help on the farm when his father broke his leg falling from a hay wagon in the summer of 1916. He never went back. He never seemed to mind. By the time he was 30, Elmer had survived the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, and 2 straight years where the crop came in at less than 12 bushels to the acre. He had watched neighbors pack their furniture onto wagons and drive west toward California, toward anything that felt like hope. He had stayed. Not because he was naive, not because he didn't understand what was happening, but because Elmer Kosh had made a quiet decision somewhere in the wreckage of the 1930s that this ground owed him something, and he intended to collect. By 1963, he farmed 320 acres in the northeastern corner of Saunders County. He owned 160 of those acres outright, no mortgage, no lien, no bank reaching into his pocket. The other 160 he rented from the widow Hannelore Brandt for $12 an acre per year, cash in an envelope, delivered every 1st of October without fail. Elmer's equipment barn, if you visited it, would have made the younger farmers in the county shake their heads. He was running a 1949 Farmall M for row cultivation. A 1953 Oliver 88 he'd bought used from a sale barn in Fremont for $420 cash. A disc he'd welded back together himself 3 different times. And that Caterpillar D2. He'd bought the D2 in 1955 for $800 from a road contractor outside of Lincoln who'd upgraded to a larger machine and needed the old girl gone. Elmer had driven it 41 miles home on its own tracks, a journey that took him the better part of 8 hours on county roads. People had laughed at that too. But Elmer knew something that those laughing people did not. He knew that tracked machines, crawlers, don't sink the way wheeled tractors do. Their weight is distributed across the length of the track. In soft, saturated ground, a crawler can work where a wheeled tractor cannot. It's basic physics. It's the same reason a snowshoe lets you walk across a drift that would swallow your bare foothole. Elmer had learned this not from a manual, not from an extension agent. He'd learned it from an old German immigrant named Bernard Huftel, who'd farmed bottomland near the Missouri River his entire life and had owned a crawler since 1929. Old Bernard had told young Elmer back when Elmer was still a teenager, "Boy, the ground is only your enemy if you fight it wrong. Get the weight off your wheels and the ground becomes your floor." Elmer had never forgotten that. He was 61 years old in the spring of 1963. His hands looked like old boot leather. His blue eyes were still sharp, and he had not borrowed a single dollar from a bank in 11 years. Now let me tell you about Rex Dunbar. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever met a man who confused fortune with wisdom? Who mistook the fact that things had gone well for him as proof that he was smarter than everyone around him? That was Rex Dunbar. Rex was 44 years old in 1963. He'd inherited 640 acres from his father, a full section of prime Saunders County ground, and had borrowed aggressively through the late 1950s to expand. By the spring of '63, he was farming just over 1,100 acres, which made him one of the larger operators in the county. He kept meticulous records, drove a new pickup truck every 3 years, and served on the local Farm Bureau board, where he never missed an opportunity to share his opinions. His equipment line was the envy of every younger farmer in the county. Brand new 1962 John Deere 4010, the most powerful row crop tractor on the market at that time, 84 horsepower, that distinctive two-cylinder putt-putt sound that JD men loved so fiercely. He had a nearly new JD 45 combine, a full set of matched John Deere implements, and a machine shed so clean you could have eaten a meal off the floor. Rex dressed well for a farmer, clean canvas jacket, good boots. He kept his hair combed even when he was working, which told you something about him, though it's hard to say exactly what. He was not a cruel man in the way that some men are cruel, not mean-spirited for sport. But he had the particular arrogance of someone who has never been seriously wrong, and who therefore has never developed any real tolerance for other ways of doing things. To Rex Dunbar, old equipment was a sign of failure. It meant you hadn't done well enough to upgrade. It meant you were behind, falling back, losing ground. And Elmer Kosh, with his worn-out D2 crawler and his patched-up Oliver and his borrowed bottomland, was, in Rex's estimation, a relic. A nice enough old man who represented everything that modern agriculture was supposed to have left behind. Rex had tried and failed to break ground on 40 acres of his own lowland field that week. His brand new 4010 had bogged to the axles on the second pass and had to be pulled out with a chain. He was furious about it, not because of the lost time alone, but because of what it looked like. Rex Dunbar's equipment failing in public. So when word reached him that old Elmer Kosh was planning to work his bottomland with that ancient crawler, Rex drove out to County Road 16 specifically to watch Elmer fail. He brought company. Let me tell you what it looked like that morning. The sky was the pale washed-out blue of a watercolor painting not quite finished. There was still dew on the fence wire at 7 in the morning when Elmer pulled the D2 off the road and idled it down along the field edge. The exhaust pipe put out a thin curl of blue smoke, not bad smoke, not the smoke of distress, just the quiet breath of a diesel engine that was cold and waking up slow. Elmer's field, the 40-acre bottomland parcel at the north end of the Brant rental ground, was visibly saturated. You could see the standing water in the low spots from the road. The soil was dark as chocolate cake, shining in places where it was still holding water on the surface. Rex Dunbar arrived at 7:15 in his 1962 Ford F-100, gleaming red with chrome trim. He pulled up along the fence and killed the engine and got out slowly, the way a man does when he's already formed his opinion and is only present for the confirmation. With him were two men from the Wahoo Farm Supply, Gus Peterman, who managed the JD dealership in town, and a younger fellow named Larry Creech who handled parts and thought Rex Dunbar was about the sharpest operator in the county. There were others already there. Word spreads fast in small counties. By 7:30 there were 18 men along that fence line, some genuinely curious, most there for the same reason people slow down when they pass an accident. Rex leaned on his fender and watched Elmer climb down from the D2 to check the track tension on the right side. Elmer's bibs were clean but old. His cap said International Harvester across the front, the kind they gave away at implement dealers decades before. He was methodical, unhurried. Rex looked at Gus Peterman and said, loud enough to be heard, "You think that old thing makes it to the other end of the field before she throws a track?" Gus laughed, Larry Creech laughed. A couple of the other men along the fence looked away, uncomfortable. Elmer either didn't hear it or chose not to. He climbed back onto the D2, set his blade, and began his first pass. Now what happened next is important, so I want you to picture this carefully. The 4010 that Rex Dunbar had tried to use earlier that week weighed approximately 8,600 pounds. All of that weight sat on 4 rubber tires. The rear tires were wide, but they were still round, and a round object meeting soft saturated clay will punch through the surface layer and sink. Simple physics. The Caterpillar D2 weighed about 8,200 pounds, slightly less than the 4010. But that weight was spread across 2 steel tracks, each 43 inches long on the ground contact surface. The ground pressure of the D2 was less than 4 pounds per square inch. The 4010 on that same soil was pushing over 12 pounds per square inch at the rear axle. It was not a competition. The D2 moved into that wet field like a patient old river barge, steady, slightly slow, not pretty, not fast. But the tracks laid themselves onto the surface of the mud and spread the load, and the machine did not sink. It gripped, it pushed, and the 6-way blade in front began to build shallow drainage furrows on each pass, something Elmer had thought through in advance. You work the blade so each pass moves water toward the low ditch at the south end. He had not come to merely plant this field, he had come to fix it. By 8:00 a.m., Elmer was on his 4th pass. The field was beginning to show structure. The furrows were subtle, you had to look, but the water was moving. Rex Dunbar stood at that fence line, and he said nothing for a long time. At 8:15, he walked back to his truck, started the engine, and left. He hadn't said goodbye to anyone. But the story, Lord, the story was only beginning. Let me pause here and ask you something. How many of you have ever watched someone do something with an old, humble tool, something that a newer, shinier tool couldn't do, and found yourself wondering how they knew? Where did that knowledge come from? How do you learn something that nobody's teaching anymore? Elmer Kosh hadn't just bought an old crawler and gotten lucky. He had spent 8 years understanding that machine the way a musician understands an instrument. Not just the mechanical side, though he knew that too, knew it intimately, could feel in the hydraulics when the blade was working at the edge of its capacity, could hear in the engine when the ground resistance was climbing toward the point where he needed to slow down rather than push harder. He understood the principle that the machine embodied, the principle of distributed load, the principle of working with saturated ground rather than against it. He had learned through years of study and practical failure that the worst thing you can do to waterlogged soil is fight it with power. You bruise the soil structure. You destroy the capillary channels, the tiny microscopic pathways through which water drains and air moves. A wheeled tractor spinning and digging in wet ground doesn't just get stuck. It damages the field for years after. Compaction at 12, 15, 18 inches of depth that takes half a decade of freeze-thaw cycles to heal. Elmer's approach was the opposite: light ground pressure, slow, steady movement, and the blade work, the careful, shallow blade work to guide the water out rather than trap it. He had also done something else that nobody else in that county had thought to do. In the fall of 1960, after 2 difficult wet seasons, Elmer had driven to the University of Nebraska Agriculture Library in Lincoln and spent an afternoon reading extension bulletins on subsoil drainage and crawler cultivation techniques published between 1935 and 1948. He was 58 years old. He had read slowly, with a pencil in his hand underlining passages that made sense to him. He had come home with 3 pages of notes and a clear plan. Let me tell you about those notes. The first thing Elmer had written down was this: wet season tillage on heavy clay soils should never exceed 4 inches of depth on the primary pass. Deeper cultivation in saturated conditions creates a smear layer, a glazed, impermeable wall underground that prevents drainage. 4 inches, not 8, not 10. The instinct of a powerful machine operator is always to go deeper, go faster, show the ground who's in charge. Elmer had learned through that reading and through the testimony of farmers twice his age that in wet conditions, restraint was the power move. The second note: a tracked machine should operate at 60–70% of its rated capacity in wet conditions. Full throttle in soft ground is waste. The engine fights the tracks. The tracks fight the soil, nothing moves efficiently. The third note, and this is the one that truly separated Elmer Kosh from every other operator in Saunders County that spring, was a hand-drawn diagram of a herringbone drainage furrow pattern. A series of shallow angled cuts, working from the high edge of the field toward the low drainage point, that functioned like the veins in a leaf guiding water by gravity from across the whole field surface down to a single exit point. Elmer had practiced that pattern quietly on his own ground in the fall of 1961 and the fall of 1962. By the spring of 1963, he had done it enough times that he did it without thinking. The way a craftsman does something that once required concentration but now lives in his hands. He was not lucky. He was prepared. And now let me tell you what happened over the next 6 days. Elmer worked that 40-acre field in 6 days. Not 6 days straight, he rested on Sunday, the way he always did, the way his father had done, the way he believed God intended. But from Monday the 6th of May through Saturday the 11th, excluding Sunday, he put the D2 into that bottomland field and he worked it. He began early each morning, 5:30, sometimes 5, while the air was still cool and the engine ran happy. He shut down at noon, ate a sandwich and drank cold coffee from a thermos his wife Helen had filled, and napped for 30 minutes in the cab with his cap over his face. Then back at it until the evening light dropped too low to work safely. Day 1, the herringbone furrows, slow, shallow, methodical. By evening you could see water trickling through the cuts he'd made. Not flooding, trickling, moving, leaving. Day 2, the surface was measurably drier in the upper sections. He began light tillage with a toolbar blade, 4 inches deep, no more, as his notes said. The soil came up in clean ribbons, not muddy clods, a good sign. He adjusted his pass spacing 3 times that day based on what he was reading in the soil texture. Day 3, let me tell you, was the hard one. A half-inch of rain came in overnight, and 3 men stopped on County Road 16 in the morning to look at the field and shake their heads, figuring Elmer was done. Set back a week at least. Elmer had the D2 running by 6:30. The rain had softened the surface but had not undone the drainage work. In fact, and this was the thing that made one of those roadside observers drive home and not come back, because what he saw troubled him in some way he couldn't quite name. In fact, the new rain had moved through the surface furrows and was draining off the field more quickly than the day before. The system was working. By the end of day 3, Elmer had completed his primary tillage on 31 of the 40 acres. Day 4, he rested on Sunday. Day 5, Monday, he finished the remaining 9 acres. Day 6, Tuesday the 14th of May, he pulled the D2 off the field and replaced it with his Oliver 88 and a 6-row planter. He planted Pioneer Brand 321, a hybrid corn at $32 per bag, calculated at 7 pounds of seed per acre, which penciled out to roughly $82 in seed for the 40 acres. He planted through Wednesday afternoon. On Thursday morning, the 16th of May, Elmer Kosh sat on the tailgate of his old Dodge half-ton and looked at that field, which was showing the parallel lines of a properly planted corn field from one end to the other. And he drank a cup of coffee and felt, as near as anyone who knew him could describe it, quiet. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just quiet. His wife Helen brought lunch out to him that afternoon and later told their daughter that when she walked across the field to where Elmer was checking a corner, the soil was firm enough underfoot that she didn't lose a single step. Like a proper field, she said. Like it had been worked right. Now let me tell you what Rex Dunbar was doing that same week. Rex had eventually got his own lowland field worked by hiring a contractor from Fremont who brought in a larger, heavier machine on a different approach. But the cost ran him $420 for 2 days' work, and the field was worked late. By the time Rex got his corn in the ground, he was 11 days behind Elmer Kosh. In corn country in Nebraska, 11 days is not nothing. 11 days is the difference between a good year and a short year if the fall comes early. Rex's corn came in at 67 bushels per acre that fall. Elmer's bottomland field, the one Rex had watched with a smirk from the fence, came in at 79 bushels per acre. That was 1963. But here's the thing about stories. Some of them don't end in a single season, some of them just start there. Let me tell you about the day the county knew. It wasn't a dramatic announcement. It wasn't a public event with an audience. It was an October afternoon at the grain elevator in Wahoo, Nebraska, the farmers' cooperative right there on Pine Street, and word had gotten around about Elmer's bottomland yield the way words always get around in a small county. Gradually, then all at once. Elmer came in on a Wednesday to settle his tickets. He was wearing the same bibs he always wore, same cap, same cracked leather work boots. He handed Madeline at the front desk his weight tickets and she tallied them up and told him his check would be ready Friday, and he nodded and turned to go. Rex Dunbar was in the lobby. He had come in for the same purpose, settling his tickets, and he had not expected to see Elmer there. The two men looked at each other. Rex opened his mouth and what came out was not mockery, not a joke about old equipment or relic farmers. What came out was nothing. He closed his mouth. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he has been wrong and knows it, but has not yet found the vocabulary to say so, and he stepped aside to let Elmer pass. Elmer said, "Morning, Rex," in the same tone he used for everyone and walked out. Gus Peterman, the JD dealer, heard the story secondhand by Friday. He told Larry Creech, who told 3 other people, and by the following week it had become one of those small legends that rural counties keep alive for years. The story of the old man and the old machine and the wet field and the yield that nobody thought was possible. For a while, Rex Dunbar was quieter at Farm Bureau meetings. Not permanently, men like Rex don't stay quiet forever, but for a while. And Elmer Kosh went home and serviced the D2, changed the oil, greased the track rollers, cleaned the air filter, and put it back in the shed. He didn't tell that story for years. He didn't need to. Now let me tell you what happened over the next 20 years. Because that's where this story becomes something larger than one wet field in one Nebraska spring. 1963 rolled into 1964 and 1964 into the late 60s, a period of genuine prosperity for most Midwest farmers. Commodity prices were rising slowly but steadily. Federal programs were supporting corn and wheat prices. Land values in Nebraska were climbing. The optimism was real. Rex Dunbar expanded. Year after year, he borrowed to buy more ground. Land at $700 an acre in the mid-60s became $1,200 in the early 70s. He leveraged the appreciated value of his existing land to finance the purchase of more land, a strategy that the banks in that era were actively encouraging. By 1975, Rex was farming just over 2,200 acres. He had 3 full-time hired men. He had upgraded his equipment line twice. He was a respected figure in the county, served on the Saunders County Farm Bureau board, and was beginning to talk, quietly, among friends, about the possibility of a seat on the local bank's board of directors. Elmer Kosh, during those same 20 years, did something different. In 1965, he purchased, with cash, an additional 40 acres adjacent to his rental ground, bringing his owned acreage to 200. He paid $3,150 for it, which was slightly below market. He paid with a cashier's check. He continued renting the Brandt ground. Hannelore Brandt passed away in 1968 and her son Werner inherited the land. Werner Brandt lived in Omaha and had no interest in farming. He was perfectly happy to have Elmer continue renting at a fair rate, and in 1971 he offered to sell Elmer the 160 acres at $1,200 per acre. Elmer thought about it for 2 weeks, spoke with Helen, and said yes. He financed $60,000 of the $192,000 purchase price through the Farm Credit Administration at a fixed rate of 7.2%. The rest he paid in cash from savings he had accumulated over 40 years of careful living. He was now farming 360 acres. He owned 320 of them. He owed $60,000 on 32-year-old terms that he would fully pay off in 1989, 12 years ahead of schedule, as it turned out. In 1972, Elmer finally retired the D2, not because it had failed, because he needed more power, more acres to tend, longer seasons, faster work. He purchased a 1969 Case 1030 Traction King, a wide front row crop tractor, at an equipment auction for $2,600. He kept the D2 in the shed. He kept it because it had earned its place there. Now the late 1970s and early 1980s. Let me tell you about the farm crisis, because you cannot tell this story without it. In the late 1970s, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker began a series of dramatic interest rate increases designed to break the back of the inflation that had been grinding at the American economy for a decade. By 1980, the prime interest rate hit 21.5%. 21.5%. Think about what that meant for a farmer who had borrowed, heavily, at variable rates, to buy land at peak 1979 values of $2,500, $3,000 per acre. When the rates rose, land values collapsed. By 1983, Nebraska farmland that had sold for $2,500 per acre in 1979 was selling for $1,400, sometimes less. And the interest on the debt that had been taken out to buy that land hadn't gone down. It had gone up. Rex Dunbar had, by 1979, accumulated approximately $2.8 million in outstanding agricultural debt. He had borrowed at variable rates from the First National Bank of Wahoo, from the Federal Land Bank, and from a private lender in Omaha who had been offering farmers attractive terms in the boom years. In 1981, Rex's interest payments alone exceeded his net farm income. In 1982, he sold his JD Combine at a loss to make a debt payment. In 1983, the First National Bank of Wahoo called a note, $140,000 due within 60 days. Rex Dunbar, who had mocked an old man's old crawler from a fence line 20 years earlier, sat in his farmhouse on a Tuesday night in March of 1983 and tried to figure out how he was going to save the farm that his father had given him. Well, he couldn't. And on a Wednesday morning in April of 1983, Rex Dunbar drove his Ford pickup, not new anymore, not gleaming, just a truck, down County Road 16 to the farm of Elmer Kosh. Elmer was in the equipment shed when Rex pulled in. He heard the truck and walked out, wiping his hands on a rag. Rex Dunbar, 64 years old now, heavier, slower, wearing the look of a man who has slept badly for months, got out of the truck and stood in the yard and said, "Elmer, I don't know who else to ask." And he told Elmer what had happened. All of it, the debt, the bank, the 60-day call. He asked if Elmer knew of any way, any resource, any contact, any option he hadn't thought of that might help. Elmer listened. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not reference 1963. He did not mention the D2 or the fence line or the smirk on a spring morning 20 years gone. He said, "Come inside, Helen's got coffee." They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Elmer made 3 phone calls, one to a farm credit counselor in Lincoln he'd met through the extension office, one to a bankruptcy attorney in Omaha whose name he'd clipped from the farm paper and kept in his desk drawer since 1980, and one to Werner Brandt's son in Omaha, who was now in commercial real estate and occasionally dealt in distressed rural land. Elmer did not solve Rex Dunbar's problems. The problems were too large and too deep for solving by one quiet man over 1 cup of coffee. Rex lost 600 acres in the subsequent bank proceedings. He restructured the remaining debt over 12 years. But he kept the home farm, the original 640 acres that his father had left him. Because of those phone calls. Because of that kitchen table. Because of a man who had been laughed at from a fence line and had never once reached for the opportunity to return the favor. Let me tell you what I think this story is really about. It's tempting to frame it as a story about vindication, about the humble man eventually proven right, the arrogant man eventually brought low. That's satisfying. There's something in us that wants that shape to a story, wants the ledger to balance, wants the world to be that neat. But I don't think that's what this story is truly about. Because Elmer Kosh was never trying to be vindicated. He wasn't thinking about Rex Dunbar when he drove out to that wet field in May of 1963. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He was trying to plant corn on 40 acres of bottomland that needed planting, and he was going to do it the right way, with the right machine, the right technique, and the right understanding. Because he had invested in that understanding, had sought it out, had carried it for years in a set of handwritten notes in a desk drawer. That's not vindication, that's preparation. There's an old saying in farm country, and I don't know who first said it, because it's the kind of thing that doesn't belong to any one person but to a whole way of life that goes like this. The best time to fix a fence is before the cattle get out. Elmer Kosh had fixed his fences, not because he knew exactly what was coming, but because he was the kind of man who understood that difficult days are not exceptional events to be survived. They are the expected conditions of a life lived seriously, and they deserve to be prepared for seriously. His old D2 crawler was not a symbol of poverty or failure or being left behind. It was a symbol of knowing what the right tool is for the job and having the independence of mind to use it, even when everyone along the fence line is laughing at you. Let me pause here and ask you something. How many things in your own life have you set aside, old skills, old knowledge, old tools, old ways of doing things, because someone told you they were outdated? Because someone with a newer truck and a cleaner jacket implied that holding on to them meant you were falling behind? And how many of those things, if you had kept them and understood them deeply, might have carried you through a moment when everything else bogged to the axles? Rex Dunbar lost 600 acres because he confused scale with wisdom, because he mistook the rising of the tide for the power of his own swimming. He was not a foolish man in the broad sense. He was a capable farmer who made a fundamental error that was very common in his time. The error of believing that growth is always the right direction, that leverage is always the right strategy, that the man with the bigger equipment and the larger operation and the more impressive machinery has always got it figured out more correctly than the quiet man with the old crawler parked in the back of an unimpressive equipment shed. Elmer Kosh died in 1991. He was 89 years old. He died on his farm, the farm he had owned outright with no debt for over a decade. His son Leonard and his daughter Martha inherited the ground, which by that time was worth more than $2 million. He is buried in St. John's Lutheran Cemetery, north of Wahoo, Nebraska. The Caterpillar D2, the same one, serial number 5J1847, vintage 1951, sat in the Kosh equipment shed until Leonard donated it to the Saunders County Historical Society in 1994. It is there today on display, looking exactly like what it is. A modest, worn, quiet machine that outlasted everything that had ever laughed at it. And Rex Dunbar, who rebuilt his operation slowly, carefully, on far less ground and far less debt than before, attended Elmer's funeral in November of 1991. He sat in the third pew of St. John's Lutheran Church, and those who were there say that when the service was over and people were filing out into the cold November air, Rex Dunbar stood by the door for a long time looking at the casket. He didn't say much, they report. But then some things don't need saying. Let me tell you the lesson Elmer Kosh left behind, not in any formal statement, not in a book or an interview or a recorded testimony, because Elmer Kosh was not that kind of man. He left it in the yield records filed at the Farmers Cooperative. He left it in 60 years of debt-free land ownership. He left it in a set of handwritten notes in a desk drawer, notes taken by a 58-year-old farmer in a university library, notes about soil drainage and track pressure and working with the ground instead of against it. And he left it in the memory of a wet spring morning in 1963, when 18 men stood along a fence line and watched an old machine do what a new one couldn't. The ground doesn't care about your equipment line. The ground doesn't care about your farm bureau position or your credit rating or the size of your operation or whether your boots are clean. The ground cares whether you understand it. And the men who understand it really understand it the way Elmer Kosh did are never as impressed with the loud and the new as the rest of us tend to be. They're too busy watching the soil, reading the drainage, thinking about spring. They'll be ready when it comes. They always are.